In this lesson, we will focus on modernizing and securing legacy systems using Spring Security for Spring 5 and Jakarta Enterprise Edition 8. This is what we'll learn. We'll look at core Spring Security architecture and the filter chain. We'll look at authentication using form login with basic authorization and OAuth with 2.0 JWT. We look at authorization with role-based and expression-based access control. We will also take a look at securing REST APIs and integrating it with Jakarta Enterprise Edition 8. And we will prepare our legacy systems for Spring Boot migration. Now, if you've been following along, you would have seen that we already have an authentication service that stores the user in a session. We also have the authentication filter and the user admin principal. We have a JSP login form that works together with our existing authentication filter and user admin principal. We also have session validation, and then finally we have a logout. Now, this is still not fully using the Spring Security framework. So what we'll do now is go over to Eclipse and look at our existing code and flow. So here we are in Eclipse. So let's run our current Charity Spring JPA. And on server, we've got our Charity Spring JPA with Spring Web 5.3.29. Select Finish. And we see the login screen. So let's go back and look at our log. Root web application context, initializing started, repository configuration delegate, bootstrapping, finish Spring data repository scanning, post-processing registration delegate. Then we have our endpoint mapping. We have a local container entity manager factory bean, some transformer factory utility, soap message factory, common XSD schema utility, factory utils, red pools. Then we start with the Spring dispatcher, post process checker, completed initializing, then the dispatcher servlet. Then we have message dispatcher, soap again, and we see our authentication controller get, which is the back end of our login screen. Let's go back to the login screen. And we see we've logged in successfully with the username and password. Essentially, when we hit the button, we post it. And then we see the Hibernate getting the user admin username, looking at registration and getting the registration. Now let's jump over to our course documentation. So we have our overview document, gives us the course overview, tell us what we'll learn and for who this course is for, and of course what technologies we cover, and the core security concepts, and our project setup checklist. Now we've already kind of blasted past that, so let's go back and look at authenticating users with Spring Security Part 1. And this is what we are currently looking at. Our current authentication architecture. We have the bootstrap configuration where we have an authentication filter that ensures protected URLs for registration, chat, and session. And then we also have a logging filter. We just looked at the logs. So here is the authentication code snippet, add filter, add for URL patterns. Then you look into the authentication filter, which is a servlet filter. It checks if the session contains a valid principal. It redirects unauthenticated users to the login page, and it wraps the request to expose the authenticated principal. Here's the code snippet. We get the user admin principal from the session. We redirect to login, or we add it to our filter. And then we look at the user admin principal as where we wrap our username and password into our HTTP session. This is where we set it. This is how we get it. And then our login form, it uses the Spring tags for username and password, for field level and general error messages, for our validation error display. Here is the example snippet with the post. We've just done a post of this form, username and password. Then on the back end, we have our authentication controller, which manages the login, logout, login form validation, session creation, and management. So the get shows the login form, or it redirects if already logged in. The post validates the form fields. It uses the authentication service to authenticate, and it stores the principal in session and regenerates the session ID, and then it redirects to the registration list on success, or it will display errors on failure. And then there's a get logout, which invalidates the session and redirects to the login page. From our controller, here is a code snippet. So here's our login post for our log, which we just saw. We get the principal and return it to registration redirect. If it has errors, we set the password to null and return to the login form. Then we do the authentication of the principal from the username and password. If there's errors, we set it to null, add the errors, and return to login. Once again, we check if the principal is null, set the password to null, set the login failed to true, and return to the login. Otherwise, we set the principal inside the session, and we change the session ID, and we go to the registration. This is the current flow. Login, authenticates via authentication service, stores user in session in a user admin principal object. Session ID is changed to protect against fixation attacks. Then we have session validation, where the authentication filter ensures only logged in users can access protected resources. Then we have logout, which invalidates the session and redirects to the login page. So now we have fully documented our existing login and authentication approach. We're going to look at the current gaps in our security for the CSRF protection and concurrent session. We are going to integrate Spring Security gradually, starting with the security filter chain to standardize authentication, and we're going to migrate our existing authentication controller logic to Spring Security's form login flow. And that concludes our lesson on our existing security flow. In the next lesson, we will attempt to improve it.